YouTube crew, it is Multiplier here to tell you about an idea. And this idea is whenever you do anything in music production, could be mastering, mixing, sound design, songwriting, literally anything, you're not making your track better or worse, you're simply making it different. So let's do an example. Let's say you're mastering and you're applying a limiter. Now, when you limit more aggressively, for some people, this will make your track louder, but for others, this will give your track less dynamic range because of perceived loudness normalization. Now, it's almost like a perspective, a way to look at everything you do in music. You're not making a track better or worse, you're simply changing it, which may make it better for some people and worse for others in other situations. And therefore, the real magic in music production is understanding how every change you make affects any given playback situation and listener expectations too. For example, songwriting, because I normally talk about sound design and mixing and mastering. So in songwriting, a listener's expectation affects the ideal complexity. If you're making, say, Big Room, the drop melody, for example, will obviously be simpler than almost anything in the universe. And that's the point. In that situation, simpler is better. But in other situations, classical music's the extreme example, a more complicated melody is better. And so it's not even just playback devices and situations and environments, etc. It's listeners' expectations. Another example, a super simple one. Let's say you're doing something as simple as a vocal. You've got a vocal in a tune and you're wondering, how loud do I make the vocal? This much or this much? Well, on some playback devices, in some situations, this much is best, and in other ones, that's too loud. So this is best. But then here is too quiet for other people. Let me give you a more specific example. Outside, I have my automobile, my car, and inside of this, there's some speakers. Obviously, it's a car. And the speaker system is completely done a bunch of fanciness to try and be fancy, which I think probably works well with classical music, but not electronic music. So much so that almost every electronic music track I've ever listened to in there sounds like it's been mixed incorrectly. I mean, I can't even hear the vocal. The vocal, for example, almost always is too far back in the mix with electronic music. It's something to do with the surround sound. They basically process the input and make it apparently better and more surround. But in fact, what they do is throw the vocal into the background and make it almost unhearable. So in my car, I'd have to mix music completely differently compared to for these speakers or headphones or a laptop or pretty much any other playback device. There seems to be this very understandable but incorrect assumption that there is this happy medium where it sounds best on all systems, where, say, the vocal is the perfect loudness on every speaker system, if just you get it to that just perfect position. This is incorrect, untrue, unfortunately. Basically, you have to make decisions. And this perspective I want you to adopt is that of looking at all your decisions from songwriting to sound design, ideas, mixing, mastering. Look at all of these decisions in the context of how different playback devices, different situations, to different people sort of work, respond. I got lost in my sentence there. Another example, dry versus wet. A very dry track with not many effects, not much reverb, or say no reverb, no delay, no little details. On headphones, a very dry track sounds like it's missing something. Doesn't sound very exciting at all, as everything's dry and just not that exciting. Whereas in a club, a rave, a festival environment with a big space, you've been to a club or a festival, or maybe seen one in a picture, maybe it's a big tunnel. In that situation, a dry track is actually better because the space itself is adding all this reverb. The venue itself is applying its own reverb. And so you actually want to make your track dry to sound best in that environment. If you made it wet, then all the little wetness you added, the reverb, the delay, the little details, best case, these little details are too subtle to be heard and therefore get missed. And so if they're an important part of the song, then your song's missing. And or all this extra wetness you're adding, the details, the delay, the reverb, in a club, a rave, a big tunnel, will in fact rumble up your mix and make it more messy, sort of all over the place. And as I think I've mentioned in another video, this also applies to saturation. As you may not realise this, but even expensive headphones and medium to expensive sound cards, etc., do actually distort. And so what you're hearing pretty much at all times in your entire life through all speaker systems is anything from a slightly distorted sound to an extremely and extremely distorted sound. I mean, if you go to a rave and someone's cranking the mixer too high, they've got the speakers too loud, then you're hearing distortions, quite audible distortions from the speakers. I remember I went to a techno rave once, and pretty much every kick drum for the entire night was distorted, so they sounded exactly the same. You couldn't hear the nuanced difference between each kick drum and each techno track. It was just as you heard the same distortion on literally every single kick drum. And if you know techno, which you may have heard a techno track, you know how they love their kick drums. That means that almost all the tracks sounded the same. That was it's a good night there. Anyway, perspective. It's a perspective. Think about, as I say, I'll say it one more time. When you do anything in music production, from the songwriting to the mixing, mastering, sound design, all that sort of stuff, you're not making your track better or worse. We're simply making it different, which in some situations may be better, other situations worse. And that's how you need to think about literally everything you do. And if you don't feel like you maybe currently know how, say, saturation differs from headphones to monitors to laptops to cars to raves, then I would prioritize that as your next thing to understand. Because, here's another way to look at it. We're not, I mean, it may appear like we're creating a file. That's what we're doing when we write a song. But what we're actually doing is creating a file that then gets heard somewhere. I mean, if you just make a file on your computer, bumped into the chair, file on your computer, a bunch of bits and data and stuff, that's cool, but presumably someone at some stage is going to hear it. And so you have to think about the entire bit, there's stuff after you create the file and not just the file itself. Fantastic. My name has been Multiplier, it still is Multiplier, and I will catch you guys on the flippity flip.